Hi everyone. In this video, we're going to look at another of the key questions that we need to be able to answer for our GCSE about Kenilworth Castle. But before we do that, before we focus on this new question, let's do a quick check and a quick remembering about some of the key things we've learnt that happened at Kenilworth. So here's your challenge. I'm going to give you 6 events here, so 6 major things that happened at Kenilworth. And what I want you to do is to pause the video and I want you to try and work out which of these happened first. So what is the order of these events? They're all mixed up. See which one happened first, which one happened second, etc. So once you think you've worked out what the correct order is, you can then, as an extension, think about when did each event happen and have a guess. Okay, so pause the video. And when you think you've worked it out, you can continue and we'll check your answers. Okay, let's have a look. So the first one is this. So King John makes big building developments, including making the mere much larger. So the mere, remember, is that water defensive feature around the side of the castle. So that's the first thing that happened in this list. The second thing is that siege of Kenilworth. So this is one of the biggest events that happens in the castle's history. Rebels against the king stay inside the castle for around 6 months with the king's army surrounding. Which of the remaining 4 things happens next? Well done if you got those first 2 right. Well, the next bit is this. A huge new great hall is built by John of Gaunt. And well done if you worked out that this great hall, which was kind of a palatial part of the castle, that happens after the more kind of military parts of the castle, where they're building the mere and they're building, and when the siege is happening. Okay, which bit happens next? Okay, next bit is when Queen Elizabeth I makes her visit. And remember all those amazing things which Robert Dudley put on to try and impress her. Next up, we've got 2 left. The next bit is this. So well done if you're getting all these right. Parts of the castle are destroyed during the English Civil War, and that leaves the castle in a bit of a ruin, still how we see parts of it today. And the final thing then, of course, is the first tourist guidebook for Kenilworth is published. Let's have a quick check of the dates. Well done if you guessed these and you're getting close, or if you got any of them perfect. That's really great. So King John makes his developments around 1210. So that's within the first 100 years of the castle's existence. The siege, a really important date for us to try and remember. Okay, so that's 1266 that happens. The huge new Great Hall, which is a kind of symbol of the castle becoming this real palatial residence, that happens between around 1373 and 1380. Queen Elizabeth I visits, again, another date we should really have in our minds. That happens in 1575, okay? So this is now, the castle's been around for over 450 years, and we're getting kind of slowly more towards the present day, although still, of course, nearly 450 years ago. Next up, the Civil War, when many castles were slighted, is the key word we use for kind of destroyed. So that's around 1649, 1650. That's when the parliamentarians go to war against the King of England, trying to kind of change the structures of power in Britain. And then the first tourist guidebook is published in 1777. And again, it's kind of a key date we might want to remember because it tells us that Kenilworth's purpose became more about people visiting it for tourism, and it tells us people weren't necessarily living there and the castle wasn't in good condition by that time. So well done if you got all of those right and you guessed or got close to some of the dates. That's fantastic. Let's move on then to our focus for today. And we're going to look at this question. So this is another key question that we need to feel comfortable answering for our GCSE. What are the challenges and benefits of studying the historical environment of Kenilworth? So let's just break down and check our understanding of what this means. Now, what it does not mean is what has been good or what has been bad about studying Kenilworth. It doesn't mean it was boring as a challenge or as a benefit. It was better than the Normans, for example. That's not what we're talking about here. We are talking instead about, for a historian, and you are a historian in your GCSE. For a historian, what is interesting and useful about studying Kenilworth? Okay, that's a benefit. And then a challenge doesn't necessarily mean like a bad thing, but it means what is difficult or a problem for a historian studying the castle. So we need to have some examples of benefits and some challenges. And these can be things which you have found or you will continue to find in our study of Kenilworth, including the visit. So let's get started. Let's have a look at these challenges and benefits. One key word here is environment. So one of the main things we're thinking about in this question is, what does it mean to actually study a site, a place? What is the benefit and challenge of looking at a castle compared to, reading a book about British history? So I want you, before I go through some of these, to pause the video and to write down any ideas you've got about some of the things which are interesting and useful about studying a place, studying Kenilworth, and then also anything that is difficult or a problem for a historian in studying the castle. Okay, so pause the video and see what ideas you can get, and then we're going to go through some together. Right, so I'm going to talk through 5 challenges and 5 benefits. Now, hopefully you'll agree with these. You really need to pick about 3 of these that you kind of really believe in and you feel like you could explain in your own words. As I'm going through them, you need to be making notes, okay? So don't be like this guy. Really important as you're watching this video that you are also being active and taking down some key notes. What I suggest is you make a table a bit like this. So on the one side, you've got the benefits, the other side, you've got challenges. But what we're going to do is make sure that we've got information about each point, but then for each point, we're going to have an example, okay? So I've set out the table like this. You might have another way you want to do it, but the key thing is that you've got notes on each point, and then also an example that we can use. Really importantly, everyone, I want you to make sure you're doing this in your own words, so don't just copy what is on the slides. Okay, let's get started. So we're going to do 5 benefits and 5 challenges. Benefit number 1. Studying the castle provides an excellent primary source of information for historians. So a key word, primary source. What this means is we're looking at something which is from the time. We are not looking at something which is like a history book, which is someone else's interpretation. We are getting really involved with kind of an object. And in this case, we're looking at the actual site where something happens. So what this means is we are looking at something from the time, okay? That's what primary source means. It allows historians, when we look at primary sources, to develop their own interpretations, okay? Now, this has some big benefits compared to studying secondary sources. A secondary source would be a book written by a historian or an artistic interpretation. So there is this benefit when we study a particular site, we study the environment of the site, we get to really kind of dive deep into history in a primary fashion. An example of this would be studying the main building constructed by Robert Dudley for Elizabeth. When we look at this building, we can do our own analysis. We can analyze the size, the beauty, the extravagance of the building. And we can then use this to develop our understanding of the reasons why this was built. So we're not just reading a book and someone's telling us that Robert Dudley built this amazing building for Elizabeth. Here, by studying the primary source, studying the actual building, it can help our own understanding and our ability to develop our own arguments about it. Okay, so that's benefit number 1. After each one, make sure you've written down your notes so you can pause the video. I've just written here an example of how I would make that point, and how I've given the example about Robert Dudley. So you can look at that, you can pause the video, you can use that as a kind of template for your own notes. Once you've done that first one, continue the video to look at benefit number 2. Okay, so benefit number 2. Studying the actual environment can help us to empathize with and understand people from the past better. So empathize kind of means we can really kind of feel what people felt at the time. Now, the benefit of this for historians, for us, hopefully for you in this course, is it makes history come to life. It helps to connect with the past. Sometimes when we study history and we're just reading a book or we're watching a documentary, people and events don't seem real somehow. But by studying a site, actually, looking at the buildings, visiting it, really helps us to visualize, to see, to understand real people. Okay, and those people can kind of come to life through studying a particular site, seeing where they lived, seeing where they did, all the different parts of their life. So my example to illustrate this point would be looking at the Great Hall. And when we do that, we can imagine how grand life must have been. So we're not just reading that, in the 14th century, there were rich people that had big parties. We can see here the huge windows, the size of the room. We can start to build that own understanding in our own minds and our own eyes. And it can help us to really understand and empathize with people from the time. We can see how rich John of Gaunt was and how impressive this hall would be. But we can also think about maybe the servants. We can think about other people that would have been involved in this and start to kind of really understand life at that time. Okay, so pause the video. Make sure you've written notes about that one. Benefit number 3. For GCSE historians, studying this historical environment is really beneficial in helping us to understand how historians work. Okay, so by doing this study, hopefully we're not just learning about what happened at Kenilworth, we're also learning, what do historians do? How does history actually work? We can learn how historians try to understand the past. Let's look at an example to further explain what I mean. What we can see when we study Kenilworth is we can see and understand that historians rely on elements of archaeology, for example. So they have to investigate ruins. And this can help us by, seeing that we can see history is not a fact. History is not something which we can be definitely sure of, always 100% sure something happens. In fact, as it says here, it is something which historians have to develop with their interpretations. We can see, by studying somewhere like Kenilworth, we can see that no one can be 100% sure when or why certain parts of the castle were constructed. And through understanding this, it can help us to understand better how history works, how historians work to try to explain the past. So there's another benefit of kind of understanding the wider meaning of history. So pause the video and try to explain that in your own words. When you're done, we'll move on to benefit number 4. Okay, now I think this one is important for us, and it will be increased when we visit the castle. Benefit number 4 says, studying a site like this can really help us to understand and feel connected to our local history. So although Kenilworth Castle isn't right on our doorstep in Birmingham, it's pretty close. It's part of the West Midlands. And by studying it, we can see how the West Midlands was connected with really important events in the past. And I think one of the things that's beneficial about this is it makes sure that we understand that history didn't just happen in the most famous places that you learn about, like Hastings and London. Through studying this site, we can see that history happened, right here on our doorstep in the West Midlands, and really important things happened here. And through that, we can kind of feel, more connected, hopefully, to the history around us and see how that has maybe developed over time to create the world we live in today. So one example, I think, and this is one that I personally would be interested in, we can learn through studying Kenilworth that this area supported the parliamentarians in the Civil War. So the people around here, they fought against the king, trying to get more power for normal people. And we can feel kind of connected to those people, maybe. We can see and try and understand how they felt and think about what that means for our local area. These were people kind of against big authority. Okay, pause and try to explain that in your own words. Final benefit is that through studying just one place, so studying Kenilworth, we can get a sense of the main events and changes in British history without needing to study each period in detail. So in this course, we haven't studied the whole history of Britain. We've just looked at one castle. But through studying that castle, we can get a little bit of information. We can get an idea of the big changes that happened all across Britain. So one small example, one single castle, can help us get that kind of wider understanding of British history. And the example for that would be Kenilworth helps us to understand how the period around 1120 to 1266 was kind of full of battles and threats to power, threats to the king. However, we know that after that, the castle moved to being more palatial. In this picture, we can see in the background on the left, a building which is more about military use. And then on the right-hand side, we can see the Great Hall. So we can see how things changed over time. And again, this can help us understand that this kind of things were going on in the wider history of Britain. Now, we haven't become experts in British history, in this whole period, but looking at Kenilworth has given us this kind of introduction, or can help us give a general picture. So that is the final benefit. You're going to pause and make sure that you have completed your notes. So you should have 5 points, 5 benefits of studying Kenilworth, studying this historical site with some examples next to them. If you need to, you can go back in the video to catch up and check any ones you weren't sure about. We're now, when you finish that, after you finish pausing, we're now going to move on to the challenges. So let's see, challenge number 1. Now, this is quite an obvious one you may have come up with earlier, but it's an important one. Many parts of the castle are in ruin or have disappeared. Oops, I haven't spelled have right there. So they're in ruin or have disappeared. Now, this makes it challenging for a historian to fully understand that part of the castle. So it's a key challenge when we try to study a castle to learn about the past. Well, if it's in ruins or it's disappeared, how can we be sure about it? This is a challenge, something difficult for a historian. And a really good example of this for us is, you will hopefully remember this building, the Pleasance in the Marsh, which was built around 1422. Hopefully you remember that nothing of this building actually exists anymore apart from the earthworks. That means the parts of the earth which were used, the ground which was used to build the construction. So it's really hard for historians to fully understand that building, to really see exactly how it was used. So that's a challenge for historians studying this kind of site. Okay, get that idea down, and then we'll move on to challenge number 2. Okay, second challenge. So for many parts of the castle's history, there actually aren't any written records. So this makes it difficult for historians to be sure exactly when and why certain things happened. And this means that we have to rely on people's interpretations, or we have to rely on our own interpretations. And what's challenging about that for a historian is we want to try and work out exactly what happened. We're looking to understand the truth. But when we're studying somewhere that doesn't have detailed historical records for all parts of its history, that's a challenge. So a good example of this is that no one can be 100% sure exactly when this stone keep was built. In fact, some people think it was built directly in the 1120s. I mean, most people believe that now, but there are still people that think it probably actually wasn't built until maybe the 1140s, 1150s, maybe even later, some people claim. So that's a challenge for us when we're trying to understand something. We're studying a site in detail, but if there aren't written records, or the records are kind of open to interpretation, that's a real challenge. So again, pause the video, and when you're ready, we'll move on to challenge number 3. Now, another challenge, and this isn't something which is bad, this is just something we need to understand as a challenge, we have to use lots of different types of evidence, and they have to be used to kind of piece together the history. So it's not like we can just look at one thing or read one thing and understand everything. A challenge for a historian is to use lots of different bits of information. So to look at the buildings, look at whatever written information there is, and use all of these things to kind of build up the history. And a good example of this is understanding when and why the mere was first built. So remember, the mere is that water feature all around the castle. And what we have as historians is we do actually have a written record for this. We see that there's a record of a permit to fish at Kenilworth from around 1125. So we can be sure that there was water at this point. And what we then need to do is use this with other records to understand the construction of the mere. We need to use this written permit also then with our other understanding about why the castle was first built. So we have to use lots of different things, bring them all together to get the full picture. And that's a challenge. That's something which is difficult. When you're ready, we'll move on to challenge number 4. Okay. Now, this is not specific just to Kenilworth, but Kenilworth is a really good example where it's challenging to study the physical remains when people built on top of older structures. So when we look at this example, we can see the map here. This shows us the buildings in the middle there that John of Gaunt built, but these were built on top of other buildings. So we no longer have such good evidence of what was there before. It's hard for us to know what the Great Hall looked like before John of Gaunt knocked it down and built his own one. And also, people adapted older buildings and renovated them. For example, Robert Dudley made lots of changes to all the parts of the castle. So when we look at them now, what we see are things that Robert Dudley did, although the buildings are actually older, and it's hard for us to be sure who did what and what things looked like before people made those changes. So that's another challenge for a historian, is to work out who did what, when, and what things looked like before, now that we can't kind of see evidence for that. Okay, when you've written down a note for that, we're going to move on to our final challenge. Now, challenge number 5 is this. It's challenging for us to work out how much we can tell from just one site. And a key question for us, therefore, is to think, is Kenilworth typical or not? So that means, is it the same as places all around Britain? And one of the things that makes this challenging when we look at Kenilworth is it can be dangerous if Kenilworth isn't completely typical. So it says, if it is not, it is dangerous to assume too much about what it can tell us about wider history. So, for example, we've already said that we know the castle moved from being a military castle to a palatial castle. And although Kenilworth was mostly a palatial castle at the time, there were actually still important wars in Britain in the 15th century, so in the 1400s. So it can be a challenge for a historian to see, well, at Kenilworth, it was palatial, which maybe means that the whole of Britain was peaceful. We just have to be careful and realise that it might not mean that completely all of Britain was peaceful at the time. And this is a challenge when we're trying to use Kenilworth to understand the wider British history. Okay, so you can pause, write up your final notes, and after this you should have a lovely group of notes where you've got 5 benefits and 5 challenges of studying Kenilworth with some good examples. It might be that 1 or 2 of those weren't that clear for you, or you're a bit unsure of them. Don't worry, you can send me a comment or let me know which ones you weren't sure about, and I can explain them in a bit more detail or go over them in a different way with you. Once you've done all your notes, the final thing I would like you to do is this. So I want you to choose what you think is the biggest benefit and what you think is the biggest challenge of studying Kenilworth. Okay, so choose just one benefit and one challenge that you think is kind of the biggest benefit and the biggest challenge for you personally, what you feel you agree with most. And for each one, I would like you to write a paragraph. Okay, so I would like you to explain why you think that point is a particular benefit, and then why you think your point is a particular challenge. Try and use examples, and you can try and think of other examples in addition to the ones that we've looked through in this video. Write up your ideas. It should be 2 full paragraphs, so lots of detail here, and then you could submit them to me on Show My Homework, and I will look at them and get back to you. If you have any questions, do just send me a comment. Good luck with the work. Thanks everyone, and see you for our next video.